Okay, so this is our donut pop art project. Today you're gonna need a pencil, a ruler, a Sharpie marker, and something to color with. I'm gonna be using watercolor paints, but you can use whatever you have for color at home. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to separate our paper out into 4 equal sections. And you may need to get a learning coach to help you with this, but I have a normal piece of copy paper, and that is 8.5 by 11 inches. So I know when I split those in half on the long edge of the paper, I go to 5.5 inches. I make a little mark with my pencil on both sides of the paper. Then I take my ruler and I line those 2 lines up. And then I can just go straight with my Sharpie, draw my line down the middle of that part of the paper. And we're going to do the same thing for the other edge. The other edge is going to be 4 1/4 for the halfway mark. And if you're not used to doing this, that's okay. Just ask a learning coach for help. Just lining it up so you get a nice even straight line, using the edge of the ruler to guide your marker. And be careful not to get Sharpie on the table. Okay, we're done with that ruler for now. So now what we're going to do with our 4 equal spaces is we're going to draw in our donut design. Now we can do 4 of the same donut, or you can change the donut's design up a little bit in each square. It's up to you. What I like to do is make sure I draw nice and big. So the first thing that I'm going to do in each square is I'm going to draw the outside of the donut. And donuts are kind of irregular sometimes, so they don't have to be a perfect circle. As close to a circle as you can get. If you would like to do this step in pencil first and then trace later with your Sharpie, that's always a good idea. Okay, so our outside edges of our donuts. Then we're going to put in the small donut hole near the middle for each donut. And then we're going to put in the glaze. So the glaze is going to require that we do another line near both of the lines we've already drawn on our donut. And then that whole area in there is going to be the icing or the glaze on our donut. So do that on each of your 4 donuts. And you can kind of make those lines wiggly if you want. Okay, so now I have my 4 donuts drawn. Now I'm going to go through and on maybe 2 opposite corners, I'll put on sprinkles. So just some little skinny ovals spread across the surface of your donut. Try to change the angle of that sprinkle so that you're not just having all the same angle there. It'll make it look more realistic if you change up kind of the way that sprinkle is facing. And I'm going to do that on 2 opposite corners. You don't have to do sprinkles if you don't want to. You can just leave the donuts as is. I'm also going to do a more complicated icing line, kind of like a zigzag on one of these. Okay, so I've got my 2 sprinkles done. Maybe on this one I'm going to draw a zigzag of icing, but I want to make sure that I skip the middle of the donut. So you don't have to do this, but this is sort of a more advanced technique. I'm going to come here to the middle and stop. Start again over here. Stop, come again over here. Kind of like that. But then I'm going to do and trace that line again so that it's going to be a different color of glaze. or icing on my donut, just like that. And then I can just leave that one as is, or I could do the glazing lines, or I could do something else. I could do dots for a different kind of sprinkle. And once you have your donut design drawn, then we're going to go through and we're going to add our color. Now the color is probably going to be a couple of days, especially if you're using watercolors, because watercolors, you want to make sure that you're not running into each other with the colors with your watercolor. Now the first thing I do when I use watercolor paints, when I open my paint tray, is I want to get them a little bit wet, the colors that I intend to use. So I'm going to take the water and add them into each of the little trays of color. Now remember, with our pop art project, we're using color. So we're going to talk about those color schemes on the color wheel. So remember when we discussed the color wheel, we talked about primary, secondary, tertiary colors, as well as what we're talking about today, which is going to be complementary color pairs and analogous colors. Okay, so analogous colors are next to each other on the color wheel. Complementary colors are across from each other on the color wheel. And we talked about how complementary colors make each other stand out brightly. So when we're doing a pop art project, you're going to want to use complementary color pairs, and you can use one analogous color pair as well if you'd like. Okay, so when we start painting or coloring in with whatever color art material you're using, you want to keep in mind what color scheme you're going to use in each of these squares. So when I'm using watercolor, I like to make sure that I don't paint two watercolor colors next to each other at any time while the paint is wet, because they will mix together on the paper, and I don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the outside background color on one square, and the square next to it I'm not going to do the background color yet. I'm going to wait to do the background color. Now if you're doing this with markers or colored pencil, crayons, you don't need to worry about that part of it. I like watercolor for this project, but you use whatever you have at home. Now with watercolors, you do have to work relatively quickly so that your color doesn't dry and you don't get really blotchy background going on in here. So make sure that when you're ready to paint, you can paint the entire area with that color. Now I'm doing a careful job. I want great craftsmanship on this project. So I do want to make sure that I'm not going over my Sharpie lines too much. I want that to look really nice. Now since I just painted this background, I can also paint this background. And what I'm doing is I'm planning out what colors I'm using. So you want to think about what color your donut scheme is going to be in each square before you start coloring or painting, because you want to make sure that you have that figured out. So I'll do the complementary color pair of blue and orange in this square, and I'll do the complementary color pair of purple and yellow in that first one that I painted. And I'll do red and green in another one, and then I'll do an analogous color scheme in the last square. And I want to make sure that I have a different background color for each of my squares. So you want to think about not putting two colors right next to each other for backgrounds. And I forgot to do the inside circle in that first area, so I'll have to go back and get the inside of that donut hole over there when I'm done with this blue. Now when you're working with watercolors, you always want to make sure you rinse your brush really well in between switching colors, because you don't want to contaminate your paints and you don't want to get the wrong color on your paper either. So now once I go through and I get these two backgrounds, I'm not going to do the backgrounds next to them because I don't want those things to come together. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to work on the colors of the donut next. So each of my donuts I'm going to paint or color in a brown color on this little piece that's left right here, the outside edge of that donut where there's no icing. So if you need a skinnier paintbrush, you can get that out. But just carefully color in a little bit of brown, make it look like that's the donut. With copy paper, the watercolor tends to dry pretty quickly, but you always want to give yourself a lot of dry time in between, just because you don't want an accident happening where you get a big blob of some color that bleeds through into your other beautiful colors. So you do want to kind of take your time with this, and we can take a second day to finish these up if we need to. So I'm not going to paint next to what I just did, so now I can do the inside color on these first ones that I started. Since I'm doing complementary colors, I'm going to do a yellow glaze on the purple background donut. And I'm not going to color in those sprinkles because I want to do those in maybe different colors. Maybe I'll do those purple as well. So I'm just carefully avoiding coloring in those areas. Move over to my complementary color pair over here, which is going to be that blue and orange. So I just want to make sure that I'm not going to get anything bleed together on these ones. So I can start with my outside edges here on my next sections. You just want to make smart choices like that about how you choose to paint in sections if you are using watercolor, so that you are not going to have a big mess on your hands. But you can use other art supplies as well. You could even do half watercolor. You could do the backgrounds just in watercolor, and you could do the rest in marker or colored pencil. So you can do mixed art supplies. reason why I use Sharpie marker for this project is so that when I do my watercolor paints, it doesn't melt my lines that I make with my marker. If I were to use a Crayola marker, it would make those lines blurry when you went over them with the watercolor paints. So permanent marker is best for something like that. My inside edge of this one looks like it's probably good to go. So I will go ahead and paint my red glaze. And remember, with green, you can also do pink instead of red for the complementary color pair. I have a standard watercolor set that only has the colors of the rainbow, so I don't have pink. But if you do, you can use that, or pink marker, or colored pencil crayon. Or you can just use red. And you're just going to continue to paint those all in, get them all finished with our complementary color schemes or our analogous color schemes. I can also make my donut more of a chocolatey donut by putting in a darker color for the actual cake part of the donut. So if I use black instead of brown, or if I use a darker brown color, I can make it look like it's a chocolate donut instead of a blondie donut. And that might help because this color orange looks pretty similar to that color of brown that I've been using. So maybe I'll go through and do that again over here, because this red and this brown look really similar over here too. And that's that revisement piece, right? We always talk about revising our work. So if you find that some color maybe doesn't look quite the way you expected it to, you can go through and add another layer of something else on top. Just make sure that the paper is dry, because I don't want you to get that paint bleed effect. So that's why this can be a 2-day project to complete. We need to give it some time to dry in between layers. Now I like that this glaze kind of ziggy-zaggy that I put on here is white. I think I might just leave that. And then I can go through and put in a different color in my sprinkles, or I can put in, you know, the same color of the background to reinforce that complementary color idea. Or if you decided to put a different decoration on your donut, whatever you have drawn on there is fine. If your sprinkles are really teeny tiny, you can use a marker or something else to color them in. Painting them in is really difficult. Okay, and that is my pop art donut project.